troops in the streets, armored vehicles blocking intersections, loudspeakers barking orders. This isn't fiction, it's happening in America right now. Is this law enforcement push to the brink, or the first step toward martial law? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're revealing what happens when the National Guard takes over your city. Donald Trump made a lot of big promises when he was running to return to the White House in 2024, and got a bigger majority in the government than he had last time. And he was determined to deliver no matter what anyone else thought. Two of his loudest campaign themes were immigration and crime. In his speeches, the two were inseparable. He accused Democratic-run cities like New York, Los Angeles, and even his new home of Washington, D.C., of letting crime spiral out of control and protecting those here illegally. His message was clear: get your city in order or he would. While he is commander-in-chief of the military is not supposed to be deployed on U.S. soil. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard are for foreign menaces. But there is one exception. The National Guard is a standing U.S. military force, a reserve component of the U.S. Army, with one for each state and territory. They're designed to be under the dual control of the local government and the feds. While they typically are there to protect order domestically at the guidance of local leadership, they can be federalized in the event of a crisis. And that is exactly what's happened. Immigration has been a top priority for the administration, but so has crime, especially in Washington, D.C. The city's had its share of crime and violence in recent years, but it all hit a fever pitch in August 2025. A young man saw a criminal incident taking place and reportedly tried to intervene. However, the group of teenagers turned on him and he was badly beaten. This likely would have been a minor note on a police blotter, except that the victim was Big Balls, also known as Edward Korestein. He's a 19-year-old tech whiz who helped run Elon Musk's Doge operation in the first days of the current administration, and that made him well known inside of the White House. And so the president acted fast. He sent in the troops. Reports of the first day after the National Guard was activated saw more military activity on the ground, but fairly little action for them. Most of the troops were gathered on the National Mall, the massive green stretch at the heart of Washington. On one side is the White House and on the other the U.S. Capitol, with the Washington Monument in between. And all around there are museums and halls of the Smithsonian. This generally is one of the lowest crime areas of Washington, D.C., with some issues with homeless residents and panhandlers, but the area is usually filled with tourists. And that made many people say that this deployment was little more than an elaborate show of force by the president to look like he's doing something. To which many say, well, better than the alternative. So far, the National Guard in D.C. has mostly been working to create an image of order with no reported arrests of troublemakers. This stands in stark contrast to ICE, which has a clear mission statement: arrest anyone here without legal status and get them to a holding cell where they can be prepared for deportation. In addition to deploying a limited number of National Guard troops to the streets of D.C., Trump has stated he's taking control of the D.C. police force. He can do this, but only within strict limits. D.C.'s Home Rule Act allows the president to use the local police for federal purposes in an emergency, but only for 48 hours or 30 days with congressional notification. It's not clear if he's done the latter yet, but there's also no evidence that the city police force now answers to the president, as it seems to be business as usual for them. If he was to try to keep control for over a month, he would need an act of Congress. However, the local attorney general has stated this entire process is illegal, as there is no criminal emergency in the district. And this could lead to multiple forces clashing. The president has stated that the D.C. police would be deployed to protect monuments and other important sites around D.C. But this is usually a federal responsibility, and the sites are usually among the most secure in D.C. One area where his power isn't being challenged, though, is in his control over the D.C. National Guard. Unlike the 50 state guards, this unit has been directly under the president's control since 1989, when President George H.W. Bush deployed them in D.C. to carry out anti-drug law enforcement. The president has threatened to take full control over the D.C. city government, exercising exclusive legislation over the seat of government in violation of the 1973 Home Rule Act, which lets D.C. govern itself. While Congress has authority over local polices and can overrule D.C. City Council acts, they have no right to federalize the city and place it under direct control. These threats have led to those in favor of D.C. statehood to step up their campaign, saying it needs to be a priority for the next Democrat in charge so no president can run roughshod over the local government again. In recent months, the president has threatened to take over other cities, using federal authorities to send in the troops. The primary targets are cities who refuse to cooperate with immigration authorities. Some refuse to hand over arrested suspects to ICE. Others block local police from sharing data. And some go further. declaring themselves sanctuary cities where immigration laws simply won't be enforced. This is a thorny issue that will be resolved in court, as local and state governments have little authority to override federal policy. And the first target might be the city that never sleeps. New York has long been a favorite target of conservative politicians, with a local paper famously writing, "Ford to city, drop dead," after the president refused to bail out the city's deeply troubled finances. The current administration doesn't have the worst relations with the New York City government, having friendly interactions with eccentric Mayor Eric Adams, but the city's general political scene is far more left-leaning, and the conflict may be about to boil over. In June, New York Democrats picked young politician Zohran Mamdani as their standard-bearer, and while the socialist hasn't won the general election yet, any Democrat is heavily favored. Mamdani had vowed to oppose immigration policies strongly. The White House responded by making threats of a full federal takeover of the city, as well as to potentially investigate Mamdani's immigration status. But going this far would put the administration in thorny legal waters, as they found out earlier this year. On June 6, 2025, Los Angeles became the latest flashpoint. ICE agents stormed workplaces across the city, rounding up large numbers of suspected undocumented immigrants. City leaders, under former Congresswoman Karen Bass, had flat-out refused to cooperate. But federal agents came anyway. Protests erupted almost immediately. Some blocked ICE vans, others clashed briefly with LAPD. Most stayed peaceful, but the tension was impossible to miss. And in response, the president called up the troops. Just one day after the protests began, the president federalized 2,000 members of the California National Guard over loud objections from state leaders. 2 days later, another 2,000 troops arrived, and more controversially, they sent in 700 Marines as well. This was a break from procedure, as the Marines are not supposed to be deployed on domestic soil. Governor Gavin Newsom sued over this decision, but the military filed into LA to restore order, and the local government seemed powerless to stop them. And things only escalated from there. From the start, it seemed like the troops deployed had very little instructions on what they were actually supposed to be doing in Los Angeles. Many reported that quarters weren't prepared for them, and the vast majority seen mainly seemed to be standing around, conveying strength to the locals. But if it was meant to calm people down, it did the opposite. Large-scale protests continued to spring up around the city, with the LAPD at first keeping a hands-off approach. However, when the conflict increased, they did team up with the federal authorities to preserve order, although there were relatively few reports of either violence by the demonstrators or police brutality. There was reportedly only one arrest by the federal authorities deployed to the city. A man who unknowingly crossed a cordon was briefly detained before being released. But this could only be the start of what a federal occupation looks like. In these cases, the National Guard was deployed with short notice and with no clear instructions on how to handle things. But the Guard has been deployed before, with far clearer reason, and usually in a more limited capacity. The president is usually able to deploy the Guard in a crisis, and the first times were before the National Guard was officially established. Prior to its creation, each state had its own militia. George Washington deployed the units in Pennsylvania and nearby states to shut down the Whiskey Rebellion in the newborn United States. And Abraham Lincoln called them all into action to make the initial fighting force to stand against the Confederacy during the Civil War, prior to raising an army. And in both of these cases, the people were largely with them. But when they're not, federal authority can be an ace card. One of the tensest periods for state and federal regulations during the 20th century was during the Civil Rights era, as federal desegregation orders were defied by Southern governors. Things escalated in Arkansas in 1957 when Governor Orville Faubus ordered the National Guard to block black students from attending a newly desegregated school. This aroused the ire of President Eisenhower, who deployed 1,200 Army troops to Arkansas and ordered the National Guard to follow their orders. John F. Kennedy would have to do the same 5 years later when it came time to desegregate universities in Mississippi and Alabama. And then Lyndon Johnson had the National Guard and Army provide security for Martin Luther King Jr.'s march from Selma to Montgomery. So this power can be used for good, but more often than not, it's simply to restore order. While most of the civil rights movement was peaceful, there were times the emotions simply boiled over and large-scale riots ensued. The first major event was in Detroit in 1967, when police raided an unlicensed bar and people fought back, attacking a cop car. As days of violent riots ensued, President Johnson sent in over 13,000 troops in total to quell the riots, and the end result was one of the costliest riots in U.S. history, with 43 people killed, 342 wounded, and 1,400 buildings destroyed. A similar thing happened after the assassination of MLK Jr. the following year, with riots erupting in more than 100 cities. While most of the deployments were limited in time and scope, the governor of Delaware kept the National Guard stationed in Wilmington for 9 months, a record for a military occupation of an American city. And over 2 decades later, it would happen again. One of the largest deployments of troops on U.S. soil happened in 1992 after the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King in Los Angeles. The riots turned violent fast, Molotov cocktails in the streets, and a truck driver pulled from his vehicle and nearly beaten to death. When the footage spread, President George H.W. Bush responded. He sent in over 4,500 troops and 1,000 riot-trained federal officers to restore order during the 3 days of chaos. He even invoked the Insurrection Act, giving him far larger latitude in how the troops were used. The cost of the riots, over 60 people dead and property damage of over $1 billion, justified the zealous response in most people's minds. But often the government deploying the troops is meant to display a heavy hand. The most infamous use of federal troops on domestic soil, at least to date, was in 1932, as the armed forces were called in to dispatch the Bonus Army. This protest was composed of First World War Army veterans who hadn't been given the cash bonus that they had been promised for service, which was desperately needed to survive the Great Depression. After the police failed to disperse them, President Hoover, who was the lamest of lame ducks at that point, gave the order. General Douglas MacArthur rolled in with tanks, troops fired tear gas, and the veterans' encampment was set on fire. It was seen as one of the incidents that led to Hoover ending his presidency in disgrace, and the worst abuse of the military on U.S. soil in history so far. While so far the impact of the Trump administration's National Guard deployments have been minimal, that could change in a hurry. In the past, the deployments designed to quell riots have seen significant government intervention. Troops instituted curfews that could make being out after dark an arrestable offense, and checkpoints or cordons that could put key areas of the city off limits without authorization. There were emergency suspensions of civil rights that led to arrests, searches, and seizures that wouldn't be possible without emergency declarations. So is this coming to a city near you? While troops were deployed to New York to quell the draft riots in 1863, this was a much smaller operation and never attempted to actually administer the city. While the president's threats have targeted the city government should it vote the wrong way, he would also have to contend with the state government led by Governor Kathy Hochul. The New York Constitution gives the governor the authority to remove the mayor in an emergency, which means the president would have to bypass those checks and balances too. Any attempt to take over New York would likely require something akin to a military invasion, as it's likely the local authorities would oppose it strongly. But when it comes to D.C., that's a far trickier question. The Constitution and local laws give the president total authority over the local National Guard and significant authority over its police force. That means that he could override any local objections, but it's also not clear how taking over the city in its entirety would work. While the vast majority of people in the United States think of D.C. as the seat of government, it's much more than that. The section in the center, featuring the historic buildings and museums, is filled with politicians, lobbyists, and other wealthy individuals. A large portion of Washington, D.C. is a working-class city, just like any other. It's filled with thousands of businesses, a thriving transit system, and a good number of tourist attractions outside of the National Mall. It's a top tourist site, and it's also one of the most diverse cities in the country. And critics worry that it could all be ground to a halt by the National Guard's deployment. Right now, only a small force is on the ground, but if troop numbers match those seen in past takeovers, the city could be transformed. Checkpoints, barricades, and armed patrols becoming a part of daily life. And the most vulnerable would be in the line of fire. While the city has had significant problems with crime in the past, recent studies have shown violent crime is at a low for the past 3 decades. Analysts say the homeless and drug problems don't compare with other cities around the country. But the White House had boasted that a federal takeover will last at least 30 days and that the police will be able to do, quote, whatever the hell they want. And that sent a chill down the spine of a lot of people. Like every other major city, Washington, D.C. has a large immigrant population, and it's likely a good number of those don't have legal status or have tentative legal status. It's probable that ICE will play a big role in this crackdown, with the federalized police force being ordered to cooperate with them and aid them in the large-scale immigration raids. And like with all the other raids, it's entirely possible that legal residents or even citizens could be swept up in them before they have a chance to prove their status. Another group that the administration has promised a crackdown on is the homeless. It has come up repeatedly when discussing crime in cities. It's common for large encampments to crop up, and people have griped about homeless panhandling or harassing people at transit hubs and other gathering places. But homeless advocates have asked where they're supposed to go. Nobody is choosing to be homeless. The group overlaps heavily with the mentally ill and drug addicts, and the idea of creating homeless camps for the DC population has been floated. But it's just as likely that the police will just take them over to Virginia or Maryland and then make them another city's problem. And for many, the most dangerous thing they could do is resist. Washington, D.C. is the bluest city in America. In every presidential election, the Democrat wins, and never by less than 56.5%. So the current administration is unpopular here, and it's likely that heavy protests will ensue if the takeover escalates. But that might be what the administration wants, as large protests or even the slightest hint of riots could provide justification for more deployments, mass arrests, and federal charges against opponents of the takeover. And so the best approach may be just to wait and see. This is the biggest move the president has made yet when it comes to federal takeovers, but the previous attempt proved to be a short-term minor deployment with relatively small implications for law enforcement in the city. Given the home rule implications here, the National Guard has much more latitude to operate, but may have less direct cause to respond to. When the National Guard takes control of a city, it's all about securing order. But the president has a whole other level of protection. See just how extreme it gets in the insane protection of the President of the United States. Or click on this video instead.